The mission is simple: to help high achievers naturally eliminate emotional and physical obstacles so they can optimize their life for higher achievement. Welcome. You have just entered the Genesis Zone. Good day, listeners. Welcome back to the Genesis Zone show. I'm your host, Dr. Brian Brown. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us today. Today, we're talking about 27 ways that the Fawn response is your primary trauma response. And we're going to talk about what that means here in just a second. Do you ever wonder why you respond to stressful situations the way you do? Then afterwards, you beat yourself up about it. You maybe go into this self-loathing type over-analyzing mode, and you think yourself into this emotionally dark hole. Well, in all likelihood, if you do that, it's probably related to what is called a Fawn response. Now, this is one of the 4 trauma responses that people can have that occur automatically, not because of this situation in front of you, but because of a past set of emotions that has been triggered by a present event or person or situation. In today's episode, I'm going to share with you how to recognize this phenomenon in your life, which is the first step to healing. Now, a lot of people I've worked with in the recent months, especially since the pandemic, are having an awakening of sorts. And they're people of all ages from all walks of life. Now, the awakening that I'm hearing, and this is kind of an amalgam of everything I'm hearing, goes something like this. But Dr. Brian, I've realized all of a sudden that I have met the needs of others above and beyond my own needs my whole life. I've nurtured other people in my life when I'm screaming on the inside for nurturing myself. And I help them achieve their wishes, their wants, and their desires, all the while ignoring my own. And quite frankly, pardon the expression, I'm pissed off about it. I'm hurt, I'm sad, I'm anxious. But most of all, I'm sick and tired of slowly killing myself by doing this. This has to stop, but I don't know how to do that. Now, last week, I talked to you about the trauma response cycle and how things typically occur in loops and how we can fall into this pattern when we go into, say, a Fawn response, and then we assign a meaning to it, which usually is self-deprecating, meaning we put ourselves down. We end up moving into this pattern of not loving ourselves and hating ourselves and being angry at ourselves for having done what we did or not doing what we thought we were supposed to do. It gets really complicated in the mind, but the bottom line, it boils down to this internally pointed energy, negative energy, where we're taking all this stuff out on ourselves when we shouldn't be. And that can lead to a concept called functional dissociation. We talked about that in last week's episode. If you missed that, please go back and listen to it, because I'm not going to go over that particular content today. So it's a good prerequisite for what we're talking about today, but it's not essential. So what is this concept of a Fawn response? And that is spelled F-A-W-N, just like the baby deer. A Fawn response, think of it this way: it is an appeasing or an acquiescing type response, meaning if you acquiesce, you're just kind of not necessarily giving in, not necessarily freezing, but you're just kind of blending into the background. And typically how this shows up is number one of the 27 ways that it can show up. And I'm not going to count these down as we go through them, because I've just got them bullet pointed. But the first one is saying anything to keep the peace. So if you're in this situation, or you've been in situations throughout your life where you just want to keep the peace, and you'll pretty much say or do anything to keep that peace, that is a Fawn response. Another thing, number 2, is hating conflict. If you're one of those people that just hates conflict, you can't stand it, then chances are you automatically default to a fawn response. The next one is difficulty setting or keeping boundaries. Listen to that. Difficulty setting or keeping boundaries. Some people are really good at setting boundaries, but they aren't necessarily good at keeping boundaries. And if you're not setting boundaries, you're not going to keep them anyway. So, but some people are really good at setting those boundaries, and a good, healthy boundary has a good, healthy ultimatum. Like if this doesn't occur, this will happen. Or if this does occur, this is what's going to happen. That's a good, healthy boundary. The next one is feeling exhausted all the time because you keep poor boundaries. Think about it. If you're constantly letting people encroach on your boundaries that you've tried to set because you're very poor at keeping and honoring your own boundaries, it literally drains every ounce of energy out of you. And it happens all the time to a lot of people. When I came into this knowledge and this epiphany and started just kind of writing down how fawn responses show up, not only in my own life, but in all my clients' lives, I realized in a lot of ways that fawn responses occur in about 90% of the clientele that I work with. And these are people that don't necessarily come to me for mental health reasons. They're coming to me for physical health reasons, health optimization, anti-aging, those types of things. And or simply just getting epigenetic profiling. And then when we start talking, we start getting into patterns and thinking patterns and beliefs, because in previous episodes, I've talked about how our beliefs literally can change and impact our DNA for the positive or for the negative. Then when I start understanding this and teasing these things out, I would have to say that the fawn response is the primary response that people default to. And I think one of the reasons for that is if you grew up in a family that, as a whole, maybe not with your mother and father, but as a whole in your larger family, the concept of family was an important concept, then chances are you were taught something along the lines of good boys and girls don't talk back. Good boys and girls don't start fights. Good boys and girls walk away from fights. Now, I'm not telling you to start fights. I'm not telling you to jump right in the middle of a fight or start a fight. But what I am saying is that type of programming a lot of times teaches us how not to communicate effectively. So next up, the way a fawn response can show up in your life is not feeling worthy of a happy, healthy relationship. So many people fall into this pattern where they don't feel they're even worthy of a happy, healthy relationship. And I see it happen over and over again where people maybe had 1 or 2 or 3 divorces, or 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 failed dating relationships. And you're sitting back, I'm sitting back as the professional, the mental health professional, thinking, oh my God, you're making horrible choices on the people you're even associating with. And it's because deep down, you don't feel worthy to have a happy, healthy relationship. And deep down, there's probably some other deep-seated things in there, but the root cause of this is you don't feel worthy of that relationship, having a healthy relationship. And so that brings me to the next thing along the lines of prosperity and financial wealth. So many people, even people that are multimillionaires, oftentimes do not feel worthy of prosperity. And that has to change. Not feeling worthy of prosperity is actually a fawn response, because how many of us have been taught throughout the course of our life that money is the root of all evil? Well, that's not exactly how that passage reads in the Bible. It actually says the love of money is the root of all evil. It doesn't say money is the root of all evil. Money does a lot of good. Okay. But for whatever reason, we've been programmed that, hey, money is hard to get and you got to hang on to it. You've got to fight for every dime that you get. That type of mentality makes us feel unworthy of prosperity. Okay. The next thing is that shows up in a fawn response is simply just feeling flawed for whatever reason. You just feel like when you look in the mirror, you're just flawed. You feel like when you pull into your internal thoughts and you're kind of self-analyzing yourself, you're like, I'm just screwed up from head to toe in my thinking, and I'm just flawed. That is a fawn response. Those are learned responses. The next one is feeling like a fraud or an imposter. I hear this all the time. I work with some pretty high level people. And one of the things that high level people struggle with, as well as your average cashier at your local grocery store, is a lot of times they feel like they're a fraud or an imposter and that they're going to be discovered or found out. I talk to people like this all the time, and that too can be a fawn response. The next thing is that can show up as a fawn response is rarely feeling like you're being seen or rarely feeling like you're being heard. You just feel invisible all the time. And that's problematic. I jokingly say, I am definitely invisible because, you know, those automatic faucets in bathrooms and public bathrooms and the paper dispensers to dry your hands with. I mean, I stick my hands under those things and they never work. I walk up to a door that's supposed to automatically open and it just doesn't open. I have to wave my hand several times to get it to open. And that's a funny way that not being seen plays out. But that's not exactly what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the people around you, the people you're most intimate with. Do they really see you? I would even venture a guess that you may even have a hard time seeing and hearing yourself. I challenge you to do this. I recently did this. So I read a paper recently that talked about Rh negative blood type people and how Rh negative blood types typically never have brown eyes. They have hazel eyes, green eyes, or blue eyes. And I'm O negative blood type. I'm an Rh negative. And I thought, well, I've got brown eyes. That's kind of odd. And I thought, well, I better look at my eyes. Well, I'm in my early 50s and I have believed my entire life that I had brown eyes. I took my flashlight out on my phone, got up close to the mirror and looked at my eyes. And I was like, oh my God, I've got hazel colored eyes. And, you know, I've got green and blue and gold in there. And I've never seen that before. So I'm guilty of not even seeing myself. And along those lines, probably very guilty of not even hearing myself. And I'll prove it to you that you're not hearing yourself too. Because how many times do we say negative self-defeating things to ourselves that are externally programming through our own ears, the things that we're saying that are negatively programming our brains, like, God, I'm awful. Man, why did I do that? And you're just beating yourself up. And the list goes on and on. It actually gets a lot worse. I've seen a lot of people do a lot of beating themselves up verbally out loud. And, you know, if I'm around them and they've given me permission, I just say, man, check what you're saying right there. One of the things that I used to say all the time is I need to blank, or to a friend, we need to get together soon, or I need this. And a friend of mine who's a public speaker and really good at what he does, I said that to him one time and he said, no, Brian, you don't need that. You may want that. You may desire that. He said, but you deserve that. So that's one way you can change your language, or you can start to hear yourself in a more positive way. But rarely feeling seen or heard from those around you and rarely seeing or hearing yourself, that is a fawn response. The next way a fawn response can show up is feeling as if you personally have no voice. Now, I will tell you from experience how this plays out. Your voice can actually get hoarse. You can go to say something out loud and it comes out as a whisper. That happens all the time to a lot of people. I've been doing deep tissue energy work to release trauma, stored trauma throughout the body. And I don't know necessarily what these traumas are, but they are being released. And for several visits in a row, one of the things that showed up was severe muscle tightness in the muscles on the side of my neck. It's called the sternocleidomastoid muscle. It's a larger muscle on the side of your neck, and it was specifically on the left side. And the person who was doing the energy work specifically mentioned to me, without me telling her anything, that it was related to my voice, and that I need to start exercising my voice more. I was like, well, I do a podcast, I'm out there, I'm always exercising my voice. And she said, no, just more on a personal level with the people around you. You need to start having a voice. And that goes back to being seen and heard. But not being seen, not being heard often manifests in the person not feeling like they have a voice. And that can actually manifest physically. You can get tightness in your traps, which is that kind of webbed muscle between your neck and your shoulder. Okay. You can get tension in your neck, tension in your throat, sore throat all the time, feeling hoarse and raspy all the time. Those are physical signs that you may be having trouble expressing yourself in having your own voice. Okay. Next up, and the next way that these things show up as fawn responses, if you do develop your voice, okay, and this is people who are working through the process, they're doing the deeper work, they're doing the energy work. Part of that process will be that even though you're starting to develop your voice, you feel guilty for expressing your voice. You feel some shame maybe for expressing your voice. And some of the ways that that kind of bubbles up is people actually feel like they're abandoning those that they've expressed their voice to, abandoning them emotionally. In that, part of the fawn responses I'll talk about in a second is feeling this overwhelming need to protect everyone around you. As a friend of mine said recently, he said, I am sick and tired of building soft cushioned little boxes to put every event and circumstance of life in so that it cushions that response for the people in my life. I've done that my entire life with my parents, with my kids, with my wife, everything. And I can't do it anymore. I'm so tired. I'm so worn out. And I think that's a perfect example here of in the example of having a voice. It's a perfect example of how we often try to cushion everything so that it lands softly and it protects that other person's feelings, it protects their emotions, it protects their spirituality and their mental health and everything. And we think about all these things. If we're patternistically in this fawn response, we worry about everybody else and we don't worry about ourselves. Now it takes a physical and emotional toll on us. Okay. And it catches up with us over time and literally will shut us down. But more and more people are starting to awaken to the fact that they can't do this anymore, that this is a pattern. And previously, I mean, I've been practicing psychiatry literally for the past 28 years, and I have never, ever seen the likes of what I've seen in the past 3 years. People are wakening up left and right. And this is one of the main themes that I see people waking to. The next way that a fawn response can show up is difficulty knowing what you like, what I like, or what I need. If you're one of those people that somebody says, what do you want for your birthday? And you go, I don't know. What do you want for Christmas? I don't know. And you just have a difficult time you just have a difficult time knowing what you like or want or need or desire. And the flip side of that is you can actually know what you want, need, desire, wish for, whatever, but then you have a hard time even expressing it. And that goes back to our voice thing just a minute ago. And that's one of the ways that can manifest. A lot of people default to appeasing others by going along with other people's needs, wants, desires, and wishes. In other words, in order to avoid conflict, it's just easier to kind of go with the flow and kind of give everybody what they need emotionally, physically, mentally, spiritually, everything. And it will wear you out. The next way it can show up is just like I said, even if you know what you want, you either feel guilty for having that knowledge in your head, which sounds weird, but it happens all the time. You feel guilty for even thinking about what you want, or you have guilt for expressing, sharing what you want. So you decide that you're going to have a voice and you just tell somebody, this is what I want, this is what I need. And then later, usually 30 seconds later, you're like, oh my God, why did I do that? Did you see the look on their face? The look on their face is like, it hurt them. Oh my gosh. They looked at me like I was from another planet. Well, those types of things are evidence that you're living in this perpetual cycle of a fawn response. And the next way that a fawn response can show up is under stress. And I'm talking about fawn responses, fight responses, freeze responses. There's another type of response called the trauma cry. It shows up differently in children than it does in adults, but it's not one that's talked about. We just hear fight or flight all the time. We occasionally hear fight or flight or freeze, but it's fight, flight, freeze, fawn, and trauma cry. Now, trauma cry, and I won't go deep into this. Trauma cry shows up as somebody develops an attachment for somebody. A lot of times it can be a health professional or a mental health professional or a friend that's very caring and empathetic. And they develop this attachment to this person in almost kind of an unhealthy way. And it's because they're crying out for help and they are depending on this person to meet their emotional needs of their hurt and their pain within their body. Okay. It's not a healthy response, but it is one of the trauma responses. But again, we're stuck on, we're focusing on the fawn response because a trauma cry response is a lesser of the responses that occurs less frequently, at least what I've seen. It's relatively new on the scene as far as awareness in adulthood, because we know that trauma cry occurs in infancy and toddlers and elementary school age kids. It happens all the time. But we're learning what that looks like in teenagers, young adults, and older adults. So it's relatively new on the scene and we're learning more about it. So it is the fourth type of trauma response that I was mentioning earlier. But under stress, whether you're in a fawn response, a freeze response, or a fight response, a lot of times people will become, the technical term that I've got for it is situationally aphasic. Now, aphasia means that you can't talk. If you've ever known somebody that had a stroke and they could understand everything that you were saying, but they couldn't get their words out. They knew what they wanted to say because in a lot of cases they can write it, but they can't get it out of their mouth. Okay. That's called expressive aphasia. Okay. So in this particular case, as part of the trauma response, we become situationally expressive aphasic, meaning in certain high stress situations, our voice just shuts down. We may stutter. We may be able to not get words out. Our thoughts may be just kind of all scrambled and we're not able to get a coherent response back to the person that we maybe feel like attacked us or actually did attack us. And we're not able to get those words out and maybe we stutter. That response happens frequently with a lot of people and nobody talks about it unless they're asked. And when you ask about it, they go, oh my God, I do that all the time. The next way that a fawn response can show up is feeling responsible for how everybody else feels. Okay, it's pretty self-explanatory. But people who stay in this perpetual loop of fawn responses, they feel responsible for how everybody else feels. The next way that a fawn response can show up is even taking responsibility for things and situations that you have, you feel compelled to take responsibility for, But in reality, you never should have taken responsibility for them. A lot of people fall into this pattern where they take responsibility for things that they have no business taking responsibility for. And a lot of times this occurs in narcissistic relationships where a narcissist sees that weakness or senses that weakness. I believe it's on an unconscious level in many cases, unless the person's a sociopath, then it's very targeted. But a narcissist intuitively knows and senses weaknesses in people on a subconscious level, and they will allow you to take responsibility for things that you have no business taking responsibility for. So recognizing that pattern and knowing that it's a pattern within you and it is part of your fawn response allows you to be able to say, stop, time out. Am I taking responsibility for something I don't need to be taking responsibility for? Because I think that's what's going on here. And you know what? For the first time in a really long time, or maybe the first time ever, I'm not going to do that anymore. And I'm going to have a voice and I'm going to say, no, that is not mine to take ownership of. That is yours to take ownership of. And I respectfully request that you don't throw me under the bus in that particular situation from now on, because you do that all the time. And that is not healthy. It's not healthy for you, not healthy for me, and it's not healthy for us in a relationship. Okay. All right. The next way that a trauma response shows up is very obvious. Just having difficulty saying no. That is a fawn response to the nth degree. If you have difficulty saying no, it's a fawn response because you're acquiescing. The next way that a fawn response can show up in your life is you fear getting into conversations where you share how you really feel, because you are really afraid that it's going to upset the other person. Again, worried about other people's feelings and not worried about your own. The next way a fawn response shows up is simply just denying your own needs, physically, emotionally, spiritually, financially, mentally. It doesn't matter. You're just denying your own needs. And that's not a good place to live. The next way that a fawn response can show up is feeling guilt or shame for expressing your needs. We talked a little bit about that in having a voice and then feeling guilty about even expressing your voice, but specifically about expressing your needs. A lot of times when people start developing a voice, they may be able to point things out that say, no, that's not right. That's not fair. But they have a difficulty taking it to the next step and saying, okay, this is how I want conversation to go from now on, because the way we've been doing conversation is not healthy. And from now on, I want you to take ownership of that emotion, because you've always put that emotion on me. And I know you don't see it, but I see it now, and I'm not afraid to talk about it. And I request that from now on, you don't put that on me. You just take ownership of that. Okay. All right. The next way a trauma fawn response can show up in your life is simply just people pleasing way too much. I think I've touched on that through a lot of these, but I'm trying to give you different ways of looking at a lot of different things. People pleasing way too much. The next way a fawn response can show up is providing for others' needs while ignoring your own. And when you go through these lists, a lot of times, and I go through this list just like this, okay? And I ask, have you ever blank? And I read through these, and you'll be surprised at the answers that you get, even though you ask the question, the same question a different way, and you'll get different answers because the subconscious is working in the background now. It's starting to become aware. It's starting to come into the conscious mind, and that awareness is starting to arrive, and it's no longer hidden behind this smoke and mirrors that the subconscious can often be for us. It's starting to come out into the conscious, into the daylight where we can actually see it. But as I was talking to a therapist friend of mine recently, it seems like the newer generation of therapists that is emerging these days out of graduate programs, they're not really taught how to do shadow work with people. And he and I were both talking that we have very strong Jungian backgrounds. Carl Jung, Jung, one of the godfathers of modern day psychology, He trained with Freud, and they had a parting of the ways big time because they disagreed philosophically on how the human psyche worked. Carl Jung is spot on. And one of the things that Carl Jung was famous for was shadow work. And you'll hear shadow work talked about in self-help communities, in coaching communities, and so on and so forth, because shadow work is very important. All of these things that I'm talking about that may seem like criticisms to you, of you, towards you, they're not criticisms. They're just bringing the shadow part of yourself into the daylight so that we can start to look at it with clarity. And now we know, okay, now that we've identified these patterns, we know exactly what to do with them. So we've only got 4 more ways that a fawn response shows up in your life. And the next one is avoiding criticism and avoiding disapproval. This is a huge one because it kind of goes back to avoiding conflict at all costs, but it's kind of on the same coin. One is heads and one is tails. And this particular side of the coin is not necessarily avoiding conflict externally with other people, but it's avoiding conflict within yourself. So in how that shows up typically is that when you avoid conflict within yourself, meaning I don't want to do the shadow work, then I avoid criticism and disapproval at all costs. Therefore, I literally sell my soul for the sake of appeasing everyone and everything else, because I don't want to be criticized and I don't want to be disapproved, to have any disapproval put on me. And you literally are selling your soul. I always tell people it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. When you avoid criticism and you avoid disapproval, it's death by 1,000 paper cuts. You're just slowly bleeding yourself to death. And I know that's a horrible image, but that is exactly what you're doing. It's literally sucking the ever-living life out of you when you live that way. Embrace the shadow side of yourself. Recognize that, yes, I do avoid criticism. I avoid disapproval at all costs. And you know what? I need to embrace that. I need to embrace criticism. I need to embrace disapproval, because it means that I'm moving forward and I'm actually doing things that people can criticize and be disapproving of. The next way that a fawn response can show up in your life is seeking safety by making others' needs, wants, and desires and wishes my own. A lot of times we fall into the pattern of meeting others' needs, wants, and desires above our own, but we never view it as safety seeking. It's safer not to have to address what I want. It's safer not to have a voice. It's safer to avoid criticism and disapproval. It's safer to avoid the looks that you're going to get when you do express your voice. It's simply safer just to give everybody what they want. And we've got to get out of that mindset of having to be in a safe place, because I would argue that that safety is a false safety. And in the long run, it leads you down a path where you are literally in one of the darkest corners of your life, and it feels like that you can't get out. So you got to do something about it. And awareness is the first step. If you are a person who seeks safety by meeting the needs of others above and beyond your own, then it's time to wake up to that and say, you know what? I don't need to do that, because that's not healthy for me anymore. Okay, next to the last way that a fawn response shows up in your life is acting as though the price of admission, now get this, this is critical, acting as though the price of admission for being involved in any relationship, personal or professional, means forfeiture of your own needs, wants, rights, wishes, desires, preferences, boundaries, you name it. Being involved in a relationship with somebody, personally or professionally, means forfeiture of all that stuff. And if you're one of those people that has fallen into that pattern, and just listening to this today, you're realizing, oh my God, that sounds just like me. I have forfeited everything about me to be in relationship with other people. Well, guess what? Hate to tell you, but it may be time that you don't need to be in that relationship. And I'm not telling you to leave the current relationships you're in, but I've had to end 2 business relationships in the past for that very reason, because I totally sacrificed to myself and forfeited myself to be in business relationship with these people. And I never should have done that. I've been over backwards. I gave them the moon, and nothing came from it other than pain and hurt and a lot of lost money. And I don't recommend that for anybody. So it can happen in your personal life too. Do a deep self-evaluation. Is this showing up in my life? And if it is, be aware of it, start journaling about it, and start processing it with somebody that you trust that you can talk to. The last way that a fawn response can show up in your life literally goes to that little fawn in the woods with the little spots on it that just blends into the background when danger arrives and the mother deer alerts the fawn that, okay, be still, there's something here. And that fawn just lays down. They curl up in a little ball. They blend into the foliage in the ground, and you never see them. You can literally be 2 feet from them. I've had this happen walking in the woods. I've been 2 feet from a baby fawn and didn't see it until I scared it enough that it got up and ran. But I call this the chameleon effect. Okay. How does the chameleon effect show up in your life as a fawn response? Well, there's a concept called trauma bonding, and I won't get into the deeper concepts of that, but just know in general that a trauma bond occurs when you've come out of a childhood trauma situation, long-term childhood trauma. And a lot of times the first person that comes along and rescues you is the person that you trauma bond to. And the trauma bond oftentimes occurs with a person that has a lot of similarities, not all of them, but a lot of similarities to some of the patterns that you grew up with in your childhood. And you're just falling into another pattern that on the surface has a good honeymoon period and is very safe and very relaxing. You feel like you can let your guard down. And then once you do let your guard down, those patterns start showing up. So again, I'm not getting deep into that, but the chameleon effect is goes along like this for a fawn response. If you are in a trauma bonding situation, as an attempt to manage your stress, your natural instinct is to adapt your personality in such a way as to blend into the relationship by catering to them at the expense of yourself, and even sacrificing who you really are. In other words, I have seen people act totally differently in those particular chameleon situations because it's a trauma bond response. It's a chameleon response related to a trauma bond. And they become different people. Their personality completely shifts. They don't have multiple personality disorder or DID. They don't have split personality, whatever you want to call it. They don't have that. They are adjusting their personality to fit into that situation so that they are accepted. Again, they are negating their own needs, their own emotional needs, their own mental needs, physical needs, spiritual needs, to adapt and mold their personality to fit into that relationship. It happens over and over and over. But once you're aware and awake to the fact that this can actually happen, you can begin to do something about that. I'm not talking about what we're going to do about that today, because this has been more than enough. This has been 40 minutes of talking about these 27 ways that a fawn response can literally show up in your life. And it is the first step to healing. If you want to know more on how to heal from these types of responses, please hear me when I say this. Message me directly on YouTube, on Facebook, on Instagram, on LinkedIn, at Dr. Brian G. Brown. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have. That wraps us up for today, for this episode of the Genesis Zone Show. Again, if you have questions, please reach out. direct message me just the word Fawn, Fawn, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you've got related to this, especially on how to get help for this, because I'm trained in systems called subconscious remodeling that help you move through these processes very, very, very quickly, doing years worth of therapy work compacted into 1 or 2 sessions. It's crazy how it works, but it works extremely, extremely well. And you'll be shocked at how well that works. Please feel free to reach out to me. Just direct message me the word Fawn, and I'll be glad to help you in any way I can. Most informed, most trusted, and most grateful that you spent this time with us today. Until next time, stay in the zone. I'm Dr. Brian Brown.